Thanks, Fowler, and thank you. So, wasn't planning on this size turnout, so I'm going to be looking at you three a lot. Because really, you're my audience for this. And the reason you're my audience, does anyone remember what the talk is about? What's it about?
It's about how economists ended the draft.
Yeah, not they, but how they helped end it. They had a big role. So it might kind of be obvious, but I just want to take a minute and say why that should matter to you. You are government grade A when it comes to being drafted. So if we had the draft now, which we did for people of my cohort, then you would be at risk of being drafted, and you're not. The draft is gone. It ended on June 30th, 1973. The last person was drafted in January of 1973, and we haven't had the draft since. So we've had 2 generations. We've had 45 years without the draft. And I call that a success story. I'll talk a little later about the kind of success we've had. But that's in itself a success story at getting rid of it. And so now you're free to choose what you want to do with your own lives. And that's a big deal. Now, we don't necessarily think of economists as being activists against oppressive government programs, and that's because they typically aren't. But there have been 2 times in history when they've been very outspoken against probably the most extreme form of oppression you can imagine. One is slavery in Britain in the early 1800s, which I'll talk about very briefly. And the other is the draft in the United States in the late 1960s, early 70s, which is a form of short-term slavery. You really are not free to leave the job, and that's kind of the essence of slavery. So let me just talk briefly about the British example. Who here has heard economics referred to as the dismal science? Raise your hand. Bob and one of their faculty members. No students. Okay. The 2 raise your hands. Do you care to say, you're willing to risk saying why it's called that? What's the history of that term? I bet you know, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so he knows. Do you know?
I've heard about it. I'm not exactly sure if our definition is...
Okay. If you ask economists nowadays why it's called the dismal science, they're almost certain to get it wrong. First of all, the younger generation, only about 10 years older than you, probably haven't even heard the term. The older generation, my generation, if you ask them, they will say the following. It's because an economist, or a writer, somewhat of an economist, 200 years ago, Thomas Robert Malthus, wrote an essay on population, which had a very dismal conclusion. He thought agricultural output will grow arithmetically, population will grow geometrically, and so population will push up against the agricultural constraint, and people will just live at subsistence, or some of them will even starve. If you ask most economists that, and they think they know, they will tell you that. So here's how you can look really smart if you ever end up in a cocktail party with economists. Ask them that question, wait till they give that answer, and then pounce. Because here's the true story. The guy who came up with the term, what? Got it?
Carlyle.
Carlyle, Thomas Carlyle, a British anti-capitalist author in the early 1800s, and here's why he said it was dismal. Because the free market economists at the time, who dominated economics, strongly opposed slavery. Get that? It's dismal because they oppose slavery. That's pretty striking, right? Who's this party animal who thinks that's dismal? But that's the truth. So economists were in the forefront of pushing against slavery in the early 1800s. But now to the current case, which is economists in the late 1960s and early 1970s. I told you the outcome. We got rid of the draft. But I probably should say a little about the draft, just so you kind of understand the enormity of it. you would get your draft notice in the mail, and it looked very official, and it would say the first word in the letter was greetings. Greetings. And then it tells you to show up and tells you where to show up. And they will take you, and they have you for 2 years. Now, there's a way around the draft back then, which is to join the military. So you join the military, and then you get a little more choice. You can join the Marines, the Navy, the Air Force. You can even join the Army as a volunteer, but then you're there for 4 years. If you don't do any of those and you're drafted, you get to be in the Army for 2 years. Now, at the time, I followed that debate closely. Although I'm originally Canadian, as Feller pointed out, and I still lived in Canada when most of the events happened, I was a passionate opponent of the draft even then. I opposed it not because I would have been at risk of being drafted. Canada had a strong volunteer tradition, even stronger than that of the United States. It was because I was and am philosophically opposed to the draft. So before going on to tell the story about how this was eliminated, I should at least tell you a little about why I'm so against the draft. And I think I can do it best not by making some highfalutin philosophical argument, but by illustrating it. And Feller's going to be my target. I really like this jacket. You know, on the way out here, I was kind of cold. I didn't anticipate this weather. It's going to be cold tonight. It's going to be cold tomorrow. So, thanks, Feller. It's mine. Feller, do you object?
Yes.
You object. Is he weird for objecting? Who thinks it was all right for me to take his jacket? Raise your hand. Who thinks it was wrong for me to take his jacket? Raise your hand. This is unanimous. By the way, whether he has the right in it doesn't depend on your vote. So if you voted the other way, I would have thought worse of you, but he still would have got his jacket back. What did I just illustrate? That his property is his. Well, if his jacket is his, what about his whole body, his whole being? If I shouldn't take his jacket by force, surely I shouldn't take him by force and force him to show up somewhere. And that is why I'm against the draft. Here's how I put it in a speech I gave at an anti-draft rally at Carnegie Mellon University in 1979. Now, I said the draft was eliminated in 73. Why am I talking about 79? There was a push back then in 79 and 80 to revive the draft. And by the way, out of that, we got a revival of draft registration, but they didn't revive the draft. And so a number of us were arguing against reviving the draft, and I was invited to give this talk at an anti-draft rally in Carnegie Mellon in 79. And here's what I said. What is the thinking of the people who advocate the draft? Whatever their differences, they have one thing in common. They believe that you are a national resource. Well, I am here to tell you that you belong to you. That you are not a piece of clay to be molded by others. That nobody has the right to take you against your will, no matter who they are, how many votes they have, or what they intend to use you for. So again, just to remind you, my philosophical case is that we own our own bodies. You own your own body. And we have the right to decide what to do with our bodies. But two incidents happened when I was young that drove that home for me in a very, very vivid way. In 1969, at age 18, I attended a political conference at Rockford College in Rockford, Illinois, and became friends with some fellow college students who were Americans and who were being afraid of being drafted and sent to Vietnam. 1969, the Vietnam War was raging at that time. Everyone familiar with the Vietnam War? Sometimes I have to ask, you know, people forget things. I mean, you think about it. The Vietnam War to you is kind of like World War I to me, not World War II, so it was back there. And so that made me appreciate living in a society without a draft, and I wanted those young men to have that same right recognized. That was the first incident. The second incident was a year later. I'd graduated from college and I was hitchhiking across Canada and down the coast of the United States and dropping in on people who I'd heard about from people in the previous city and sleeping on their couches with my sleeping bag. And this one guy in Tacoma, Washington was working at an anti-war coffee house called the Shelter Half. It was right near, Tacoma's right near Fort Lewis. Fort Lewis was a major Army installation where you went for training just before going to Vietnam. So that was like the last stop on the way to Vietnam. And people, especially young enlistees and young draftees, like to get away from the fort at night and just come down and mingle with people. And I went down with my friend who was working there, and I would talk to some of the young soldiers. And again, at the time, I'm 19. And I happen to look across the room, and I see a young man about the distance from me to Bob over there. And there's just something very compelling about him, about his face. He had on a young military uniform. He was a young military enlistee. And I just started walking over to talk to him. And as I got closer, I saw his name tag. Does anyone remember what my name is? Someone tell me. What's my name?
Henderson.
What's my first name?
David.
David Henderson. When I get maybe 6 feet from him, I see his name tag and it says David Henderson. So we got talking, and I said to him, "You look a little scared." He goes, "I am." I said, "Why?" He says, "I'm going to Vietnam tomorrow." And we get talking a little more, and then obviously he's trying to get his mind off things, and we just keep talking. And I said, "Where'd you grow up?" He says, "North Dakota." "What city or town?" "You never would have heard of it." "Try me." Dunseith. Dunseith was 29 miles south of Boissevain, where I was born and grew up. So there was a border between us that made the difference between whether I was drafted or not. And he, of course, was drafted. That, again, brought it home. I worked in the Reagan administration in the White House in 1982, 82 to 84. But in 82, that fall, was when they started the Vietnam Memorial. And I don't know if you know, they have the name of every single American on that wall who died in the Vietnam War, all 58,000 and some of them. And I went there, and the first thing I did was look for his name. And fortunately, I did not find it. But those kinds of things really brought it home to me. Now, let me tell you a little history of the draft. In the 20th century, we got the draft with the entry of the United States into World War I. The United States entered relatively late, 1917. We get the draft. 1918, the war ends. We get rid of the draft pretty shortly after. Then we get the draft again in 1940, over a year and a half before the United States enters World War II, but they're kind of anticipating it to some extent. And we have the draft all through the war to 1940. War ends in 1945. Draft ends in 47 for a year. And then they bring it back in 48. And we have it from 1948 to 1973 continuously. Now, lots of people were protesting against the draft and the war, but they were mainly protesting against the draft as a way of opposing the war. Welcome. They were not protesting against the draft on principle. So when you talk to them, if you'd said to them, I agree with you, let's end the Vietnam War completely now, what do you think of the draft? A lot of them say, okay, then it's not a problem. So they saw the draft and the war as being totally connected, and that was their opposition. But there were a number of people who were opposing the draft on principle, and a number of them were fairly prominent economists. And one of them was a man named Milton Friedman. Who here has heard of Milton Friedman? All right. And by the way, I'm not doing a PowerPoint because I saw some of your PowerPoints and I'm almost in the dark, and this is what shows, but I would show you a picture of me with Milton Friedman if I showed you a PowerPoint. If someone wants to hang around afterwards, I can show you my computer or whatever. So I've known Friedman since I knocked on his door in 1970, actually, when I hitchhiked down to Chicago and visited him. Anyway, Friedman was a prominent opponent of the draft. He was probably the most well-known economist of the second half of the 20th century. And there were other economists. There was a guy named Walter Oy. Now, Walter Oy was an interesting person. He was a Japanese-American economist. He'd been born and grew up in the United States, but his parents were from Japan. So when I interviewed at his school at University of Rochester in 1975, I knew a little history, and I just looked at him and assessed his age, and I said, Walter, were you imprisoned by the American government during World War II? And he said, yes. What was I thinking about? What did Roosevelt do to Japanese Americans on the coast? He incarcerated them. He took over 100,000 of them and put them in camps. And Walter told me he and his family had this little stall, little horse stall, the Santa Anita racetrack, where they were for a few weeks until they got shipped inland. By the way, my parents brought me up to never ask questions like that because it can lead to some painful memories. In retrospect, I think that was very bad advice, because my experience is when you ask people about themselves, you're typically asking them about their favorite subject. So he told me all about that. But Walter Oy had done this path-breaking study on the draft, and I'm going to talk about the essence of it in a couple of minutes. So he was there. He and Milton Friedman and a whole bunch of other people on the pro-draft side and the anti-draft side had a major conference at the University of Chicago in December 1966. And people gave papers, and there was a discussion. And those were transcribed into a book, an edited book called The Draft, a handbook of facts and alternatives. And I bought that book at a used bookstore a few years later. And when I read it, I had this sense of a kind of a coming together, a coalescing of views. There were lots of anti-draft people, lots of pro-draft people, and lots of discussion, but you sensed a shift. And before I get to that shift, which turns out was true, let me tell you who else was there. Two young anti-draft congressmen, Robert Kastenmeier, a Democrat from Wisconsin, and Donald Rumsfeld, a Republican from Illinois, who of course much later was Secretary of Defense. A very strongly pro-draft senator, Senator Edward Kennedy from Massachusetts. By the way, there's a movie out about it. I just saw it about a week ago, Chappaquiddick, excellent movie, I recommend it. And Friedman gave his talk, Why Not a Voluntary Army, and other people gave talks. And Walter Oy gave an essay, well, I'm getting ahead of myself because that gets into the economics, which is where I want to go in a minute. But anyway, this discussion over 3 or 4 days. And here was what Friedman said about the conference in his memoirs some years later. I've attended many conferences. I've never attended any other that had so dramatic effect on the participants. A straw poll taken at the outset of the conference recorded 2/3 of the participants in favor of the draft. A similar poll at the end, 2/3 opposed. So you had a shift of 1/3 of the people from pro to anti. Friedman says, I believe this conference was the key event that started the ball rolling decisively toward ending the draft. And there were other important economists who were involved. They weren't at this conference, but they were writing about it too, including some graduate students in economics at the University of Virginia who put out a book called Why the Draft that sold it sold 30,000 copies. Okay, now let me tell you what the economists brought to the issue. as I said, a lot of them were philosophically opposed to the draft, but they weren't just philosophically opposed. They had an actual economic argument. Has everyone here taken some economics? Raise your hand if you haven't. So has everyone here seen a supply curve? All right. Okay. Here's a supply curve. Quantity of labor, wage. And what I want to look at is the supply of first-term labor to the U.S. military. So it's upward sloping. You have to pay more to get more people. You get people who really want to be there down here, people who kind of want to be there, and people who really don't want to be there unless you pay them a lot. So, in an all-volunteer force, if you want this number of people, you must pay this wage. But one of the main reasons to have a draft is to pay people below that market wage. It's to save money for the government. And so, and by the way, when the draft was being considered again in 79 and 80, I went through every draft bill, there were about 8 of them that Congress was looking at, and all of them had a substantial cut in first-term pay. That was the point. So, you have a draft, and let's say you set the wage here at WD. You still get volunteers, but where do you go on the supply curve to find the number of volunteers? I mean, where do you go to find the number of volunteers? Yeah, where?
Oh,
From? You're paying this, how many volunteers do you get?
a certain amount.
Which number? There, right?
Yeah.
So you get this number of volunteers, but you want this number of people. So you got to draft this number of people.
Exactly.
Now, these people did what we call in economics self-selected. They joined voluntarily when the wage was here. But are they going to join now? They're not being paid enough. So now, the military can't know who would have joined. So they're, you say like me? Sometimes when I tell these stories, and I'm going to tell a few in a minute, and there are people my age or older, and they will actually tell their little story, which is interesting. So they won't get these people, but they don't know who these people are, right? Because people self-selected and showed up. They knew who these people were because they showed up. So they can't have some nice system that's just going to draft these particular people. So they have a draft, and they're going to have some people here replaced by some people up here. Now let's go back and look at where the supply curve comes from. It comes from something, I'm sure you've heard of this, opportunity cost. The amount that you insist on being paid for being there is highly related to your opportunity cost. If you have really great opportunities, you're going to insist on being paid more. If you have not so good opportunities, you won't insist on being paid as much. So, what's this mean? It means the people here, some of them, are being displaced by people up here. Why does that matter? Well, to use the title of a book that was written that made that point at the time, you get the wrong man in uniform. You don't get as efficient an allocation of labor to your people up here displacing people down here. That's the first point. And let me give you an extreme example that happened when I was 7. I know I say things like, who's heard of Vietnam and all that. This one I know. Who's heard of Elvis Presley? Wait, you raise your hand if you've heard. Okay, no one raised it. Okay. Elvis Presley was drafted when I was 7. It was a big deal. It was a big deal. Where would he have been on this supply curve? I'm not that tall. Yeah, he would be way above this building. At the time, he's making about $1 million a year. In those years' dollars, when the military's paying around $2,000 a year. So we get this very inefficient allocation of labor. Elvis Presley displacing someone who would have been willing to work for maybe 50% more than the military was paying. And that's the extreme to make the point. If we were talking nowadays, maybe I'd say Justin Bieber, right? Not sure they'd want him.
He's Canadian.
He's Canadian, eh? So, yeah. So the point is that you get the wrong person in uniform. But here's the other point. The argument, and that was a very interesting, clever argument. There's a closely related argument. And that is, people argued, well, let's have the draft so we get a lower cost military. And all they mean is, let's have a draft so the government can pay less. Is it a lower cost military? And here was the Economist's insight. No, it is not. It is a higher cost military because the cost is the opportunity cost of the people in there. So if you're getting lower opportunity cost people displaced by higher opportunity cost people, you're getting overall a more costly military. That was, when I read that argument in that book, Why the Draft, I was on the way to college, I was reading in little bits on the bus when I was going back and forth between my apartment and college, and it was like this, I think I might want to be an economist. Like, whoa, I never would have thought of that in a million years, and yet it's a solid argument. My first little inkling that economics had some things to say that were true but not obvious until you understood them, and then they're totally obvious. So Walter Oy, who I mentioned, did two things. He tried to estimate that social cost, like how many people up here are displacing how many people down there, so you get the overall social cost. And the other thing he did that was related is he said, okay, what if we did pay W star? He estimated what that would be instead of this, and estimated what that would mean for the budget. We know the budget would be higher, we know the government would have to spend more, but how much more? It turned out to be a high number, but it was where you could say, yeah, we can, our government can handle that as a way of actually having people be free. And so that was an important piece that he did. And one interesting thing, one thing I noticed in researching these things is how little people's position on it had to do with their own self-interest. So Milton Friedman's son is a man named David, who I'm friends with, born in 1945. When Milton is doing all this stuff in the late 60s, David is eligible for the draft, but he's just getting past the really high eligibility years. Walter Oy at the time has two daughters. Daughters weren't being drafted. So this isn't just narrow self-interest driving these people. This is principle. And so here's when there was a senator from Georgia named Sam Nunn was the strongest proponent of the draft in the Senate in the late 70s to bring it back. I found out he was having hearings on it, and I figured out how to get invited to testify at those hearings. And here's the kernel of the argument I just gave you and what I said to him. I said it in my testimony, but then we started kind of wrangling with each other. And he's saying, well, we can get a lower cost military. We can spend 30% of our budget on manpower instead of more. And here's what I said. What I am saying is that the cost of a good quality military is there. There's no avoiding that fact. All you are talking about is whom you make bear the cost. The cost is not any lower when you are paying 30% of the budget in wages. It is just that you are imposing that cost on young people. That is what you are advocating. You are not advocating a lower cost military. You are not advocating lower costs of labor. You are just advocating that taxpayers in general not bear the cost and young draftees bear the costs. Another player in this, an economist who was the dean of the business school at University of Rochester, was my first boss. I went there as an assistant professor in '75. He wrote a piece in Fortune magazine in '79 to push back against the draft, and the title of the piece was a beautiful title. "The draft is a high tax on unlucky young men." And let me say why it's a tax. And here again I need just a little numerical illustration. And now I'm going to use current numbers. Let's say today that you would need to pay someone $25,000 to be a first-term enlistee. And we introduce a draft, and the pay falls to $15,000. Remember, that's one of the major points of the draft, is to cut pay. It's as if you were taxed $10,000. It's as if you worked for 25 and they took 10. 10,000 as a percent of 25,000 is 40%. That's a big tax. And that's not just your marginal tax bracket. That's the average tax bracket, or sometimes called the effective tax rate. That is a huge tax. And they estimated that tax. Well, I'm getting ahead of who estimated it. That's where I want to go. So I want to introduce one more player, well, two more players before I talk about what they did. They've been making all these arguments, they've been writing these things, but what else did they do to help get rid of the draft? And it's a guy who later became a friend of mine. He was a longtime Hoover fellow named Martin Anderson. And what's striking about him is he never had kids, so you can't say, well, that's why he was against the draft. But he did he was a young economics professor at Columbia University in the mid-1960s. And he became friends with a famous novelist. I'm wondering if you've heard of her, named Ayn Rand. Who here has heard of Ayn Rand? I strongly recommend people, there's no one who's indifferent to her. You read her and you love her or you hate her. My wife, by the way, has never read her, so maybe that's why the marriage is working so well, because I don't think she'd like her. But I loved her. And Martin Anderson loved her. And there are little things, weird things about her, but she had a lot of good ideas. Anyway, if there's anyone who was on principle against the draft, it was Ayn Rand. She thought you had a right to your own body. She wrote about that all the time. Marty Anderson finds out that Richard Nixon, who's now a very successful lawyer in New York, this is 1967, is thinking of running for president again. He'd run in 1960 and just lost barely to Kennedy. He's thinking of running again. Marty goes to him. Marty's teaching at New York, Columbia University, goes to him and makes his argument against the draft. And he makes both the moral philosophical argument, you own your own body, and also just the economic argument. And believe it or not, Richard Nixon is convinced. So Richard Nixon makes this part of his platform when he runs for president. He even goes on CBS radio in October 1968, a few weeks before the election, and his whole talk is devoted to why we should get rid of the draft. Now, do politicians ever make promises and break them? Yeah. Well, Marty Anderson joined the Nixon administration, and within 3 months, he had got Nixon to put together the President's Commission on the All-Volunteer Force. So Marty, I'm sure, was behind the scenes pushing hard to make this happen. Now, if you follow the history of presidential commissions, you'll find they're usually one of two types. They're either there to punt. Let's kick the can down the road so nothing ever has to happen. Or they're there with everyone on the same side, and they're going to come out with something that the general public doesn't like, but they all agree on it. This was neither of those. Milton Friedman, in his autobiography, talks about this. There were 5 people, there were 15 commissioners, 5 in favor of the draft, 5 against the draft, 5 on the fence. By the end, the vote was 14-0 in favor of getting rid of the draft. And the one guy who didn't vote in favor or against, but just abstained, was a famous black leader at the time named Roy Wilkins, who wrote a letter to Nixon. I do have it on my PowerPoint. saying I was sick, I missed most of the meetings, I hope we can move towards a more volunteer force, but he wasn't willing to sign off on the whole thing. So that's pretty good. Now, why did that happen? Why did they do so well? One of them was Milton Friedman. He was an amazingly persuasive person. And I'm sure that had to do with it. But also they had a whole stable of economists estimating all these numbers. How much would we have to pay? We'd probably get better retention, right? You like people, you've invested in them, you want to sign them up again. Draftees don't tend to stay again. So how much will we save there? And they did all these kinds of studies. And Meckling, who I mentioned was my boss, was the executive director of that commission. They came in under budget and ahead of time with their report. And in 1998, well after I was an employee at the University of Rochester and well after Bill Meckling had retired, he died a little early, I thought. And at the time I wrote a monthly column for a magazine called Red Herring, and I devoted a whole column as a tribute to him. And I think it kind of applies to you if you kind of adjust for some ages. So here's what I said. If you're an American male under age 44, take a moment of silence to thank William H. Meckling, who died last year at age 76. Even though you probably haven't heard of him, he has had a profound effect on your life. What he did was help end military conscription in the United States. Between 1948 and 1973, here's what you knew if you were a healthy male born in the USA. The government could pluck you out of almost any activity you were pursuing, cut your hair, and send you anywhere in the world. If the United States was at war, you might have to kill people, and you might return home in a body bag. To research that article, I interviewed his widow, Becky Meckling. And one debate from her husband's days at the commission, when they were doing these hearings, stood out. One, she said that it delighted Bill. I'd heard about this, and in fact, Milton Friedman wrote about it in his autobiography. One of the witnesses was General William Westmoreland. Westmoreland had been the commander of the troops in Vietnam and was at the time Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army. I'd heard Bill tell that story before, and sure enough, Becky said it was one of his favorite moments. And here's what happened. In his testimony before the commission, General Westmoreland said he didn't want to command an army of mercenaries. Friedman interrupted. General, would you rather command an army of slaves? Westmoreland replied, I don't like to hear our patriotic draftees referred to as slaves. Friedman responded, I don't like to hear our patriotic volunteers referred to as mercenaries. If they're mercenaries, then I, sir, am a mercenary professor. You, sir, are a mercenary general. And we are served by mercenary physicians, we get our meat from a mercenary butcher, and we use a mercenary lawyer. Friedman was great that way, and he did it, I'm sure, with a smile on his face, which he always was good at doing. Okay, so that's kind of the story. They come up with this commission, virtually unanimous, and the draft ends a couple of years later. I want to mention one other economist who was important in this. Another player was a guy named W. Allen Wallace. By the way, does anyone here do a lot of statistical work? Anyone? If you read econometric studies today, like 2018, you will find people referring to this something Wallace test. I've forgotten the other guy. He came up with that in the 1930s. That's this guy. And he was the chancellor of the university when I was at the University of Rochester. 1968, and this is probably one reason he was chosen to be on this commission. 1968, a year before the commission, he's giving a speech to the American Legion of Monroe County, that's where Rochester, New York is, on the 50th anniversary of the Legion. And it's one of the best speeches I've ever read. And it's titled, Abolish the Draft. This is the American Legion. He says, the measure I propose will, I fear, shock some of you. I respectfully request that you nevertheless hear me out and think over my proposal carefully, rather than reject it out of hand. It is not a view I've come to lightly or recently, but one I've held for over 20 years. It is not original with me. Where's the... nor is it without strong support from many... You double-side when you print out. Nor is it without strong support from many respectable citizens of unquestionable patriotism. A step that would do much toward resolving our dilemma is to abolish the draft. Abolish it completely, lock, stock, and barrel. Abolish it immediately with no ifs, ands, or buts. And by the way, his speech was covered positively in The Nation. That was a major left-wing publication at the time. It still is a left-wing publication, it's just not as prominent. So let me ask you, he gives this before the American Legion 50th anniversary. What do you think was the audience response? What do you think?
They were probably shocked.
Yeah?
Probably didn't expect it.
Yeah. So far, so good. I'll tell you what I would have expected, because I've given talks to audiences that I figure are not going to agree with me. If I get a polite applause, that's an incredible victory. Okay? When I did my little exit interview with him when I left Rochester in '79, I realized I'd never asked him what the audience response was. So he went to his files and pulled out this letter that he'd written to a friend who'd asked him the same question. He's a very modest man. So here's what he said. I don't want to say it was a standing ovation, but they stood while they applauded. I think that's a standing ovation. Okay, so the draft ends. But the military isn't used to this volunteer world, so they've got some bumps in the road as they try to adjust to it. And there's an economic boom in the late 1970s combined with high inflation, and they keep pay constant. Well, if inflation's going up and your job opportunities are going up because of the boom, you're less likely to want to join the military, right? So they have trouble reaching their numbers, so they drop their quality a little, and that's why there's this renewed push for the draft. So Ronald Reagan comes along, and Marty Anderson is one of his advisors. And Reagan gets the nomination, and is an acceptance speech which Marty helped write for the Republican nomination at the Republican National Convention in Detroit. Reagan singles out that he will not introduce the draft. Oh, and I forgot, he'll end draft registration. The compromise was, let's keep draft registration in case we ever need it. But Gerald Ford, when he was president in 1975, looking around for various little ways to cut the budget, because we had this huge deficit, cuts the Selective Service Systems budget to zero. So we end draft registration for 5 years. And then Carter reintroduces it. So Reagan promised to end it. By the way, did he keep that promise? No, he did not. But I was wanting to force his hand. So what I did in the summer of 1980, when I anticipated he might win, was I wrote an Economist statement against the draft, and I circulated. I got Milton Friedman, I got Alan Greenspan. Oh, that was another guy. Alan Greenspan, chairman of the Fed, was one of the members of the Gates Commission. And I got him. I'd been on a panel with him, and he'd been kind of friendly, so I sent a copy of my petition to him, and he signed it. And I got about 280 economists to sign it. And here was the statement I made. Again, making the point I've been making. We, the undersigned, oppose moves toward the reimposition of the draft. The draft would be a more costly way of maintaining the military than an all-volunteer force. Those who can't claim that a draft costs less than a volunteer military cite as a savings the lower wages the government can get away with paying draftees. But they leave out the burden imposed on the draftees themselves. Since a draft would force many young people to delay or forego entirely other activities valuable to them and to the rest of society, the real cost of military manpower would be substantially more than the wages draftees are paid. Saying that a draft would reduce the cost of the military is like saying the pyramids were cheap because they were built with slave labor. And about 280 economists signed that, and I persuaded 3 magazines, Libertarian Review, which is libertarian, I'd expect that, Inquiry, which is libertarian, and The Progressive, a left-wing publication in Wisconsin, to give me a free page to have that ad with those signatures. So, we won. The draft has been gone now for, let me do the math, 45 years. And by the way, they've learned how to get high quality people. It's to pay more, it's to make it more attractive. They're a lot less punitive when people do things in the military. They figure out ways of working with them. And of course, you experience the result of that victory every day. Think about your own lives. I usually say in this talk, especially the young men in the audience, I can say, especially the young men in the audience, what if you decided to drop out of college today? Not that I'm recommending it, but if you decided you could. There wouldn't be this greetings thing showing up in the mail a few days later. Think about Bill Gates. He dropped out of Harvard. If he'd been 5 years older, he wouldn't have been able to drop out of Harvard and do what he did. And so it's had an enormous, enormous impact. So I call that a victory. And those are my prepared remarks. Thank you.
We have time for some questions.
And before, if once we get past questions, I do have something I want to say to the undergrads.